If you could distill the entire history of religious freedom down to a single, an electric moment, I think this would be it.
It's hard to argue with that. It's such a dramatic pivot.
Right. I mean, just imagine living under this constant suffocating knowledge that your choice of worship meant you were a criminal.
Mm-hmm.
Every single time you gathered with people who believe what you believe, every time you shared a sacred text, any act of communion was not just an expression of faith. It was a life or death gamble.
A gamble against the most powerful empire the Western world had ever known. And it wasn't a sustainable existence. It was a life lived under a systemic, generational shadow.
A shadow, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, where martyrdom wasn't some, abstract exception. It was a constant, visible possibility on the horizon for you, for your family. The entire community structure was defined by that secrecy and that resilience.
And then, in what really seems like a historical blink, that entire reality is completely inverted. The very state apparatus that spent 300 years hunting you, torturing you, trying to eradicate your faith, it suddenly and decisively flips.
It's not just that it stops, it does a complete 180.
Exactly. It not only grants you freedom, but it starts giving you political, legal, and financial protection. And the symbol of execution, the cross, it stops being a mark of shame and becomes the rallying banner for the emperor himself.
And that transformation, that almost impossible reversal is what we're going to focus on in our deep dive today.
Mm-hmm.
We are zeroing in on this pivotal moment at the beginning of the 4th century. The profound transformation of the Christian church from a clandestine, persecuted religion into a legally acknowledged and, protected faith. And it's thanks primarily to the actions of one Roman emperor, Constantine.
The sources we've been able to gather for this are just extraordinary. They detail the crushing emotional weight of those 3 centuries of fear, the high-stakes political drama of a civil war.
Yeah, and the imperial decrees that followed, which essentially pulled Christianity out of the catacombs and planted it directly onto the Roman public square.
So our mission today is to go beyond just the summary of what happened.
Right. We want to unpack the exact political and, frankly, personal circumstances that led to this monumental shift. We're going to detail what Constantine did, and maybe more importantly, what he didn't do.
And then we have to analyze those complex, often unforeseen internal challenges that came up once the persecuted church suddenly became the protected church.
Because that transition was messy, it was not simple, and its consequences are, in many ways, still with us today.
Okay, let's unpack this. But before we even get to the battle, to the vision, we really have to grasp the sheer audacity of this reversal. I mean, how did a symbol of execution, a sign of abject public humiliation and state terror, end up at the symbolic, legal, and political center of the very empire that perfected that method of punishment?
That's the stunning core of this whole story.
Mm-hmm.
To really understand the velocity of the change, we have to first establish the baseline, what was normal before.
Right.
When we talk about Constantine's decree, we are talking about ending a practice that had been in place on and off for nearly 3 centuries.
3 centuries, that is just... It's hard to even comprehend that amount of time.
It is. For multiple generations, Christians knew that their faith put them in direct opposition to the state. This wasn't a cyclical, brief crackdown that happened every now and then. It was the generational norm that defined their entire collective identity.
And when you look at the documents describing the early church, you really realize this wasn't just a political problem, was it? It was this ingrained social reality.
Absolutely.
This level of sustained threat. It just permeates every level of life. I mean, you grew up hearing stories of arrests, knowing that your next door neighbor could be the one to report you, and knowing that every single religious decision had these massive secular consequences.
Exactly. Our historical accounts paint a really stark picture of this lived reality. They tell us plainly that persecution was normal, suffering was expected, and chillingly, death was familiar.
Wow, death was familiar.
Yeah. And these phrases, they aren't rhetorical flourishes, they're not hyperbole. They describe the day-to-day condition of Christian existence within the Roman Empire, the psychological toll of living under that kind of sustained existential threat. It's something we can't overstate.
I think we need to get into the why for a minute. Why did Rome persecute them so aggressively? It wasn't just arbitrary malice, was it? There was a logic to it from their perspective.
There was. For Rome, civic duty and religious observance were completely inseparable. You couldn't pull them apart. The well-being of the entire empire was seen to rely on the favor of the Roman gods.
And you maintained that favor through public sacrifices, through participation in the imperial cult?
Precisely. The imperial cult, that recognition of the emperor's divine status, was a key part of it. And so the Christians' refusal to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods or to participate in the emperor cult wasn't seen as a private theological choice.
No, it was seen as treason.
It was seen as treason. By refusing to acknowledge the state's deities, they were, in the Roman mind, actively undermining the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods.
So they were inviting disaster upon the whole empire.
That's how it was viewed. They were deemed subversive. They were called atheistic because they denied the traditional pantheon of gods, and they were seen as profoundly antisocial.
So their very existence, just by being who they were, was a form of political defiance. If you refuse to participate in the state mechanism that you believe guarantees security, well, you become the state's enemy.
And that perceived instability, that threat, led to these intense purges. And we often hear about specific emperors, Nero, Decius, Diocletian, who launched some of the worst campaigns.
Diocletian's was just before Constantine, right?
Right. The Great Persecution under Diocletian was particularly brutal. It focused on destroying sacred texts, church buildings, imprisoning the clergy, and forcing all citizens everywhere to make a public sacrifice. The goal was wholesale eradication through legal mandate and overwhelming force.
And yet the faith endured. And that endurance seemed to hinge entirely on its clandestine nature. Tell us more about that, the practical reality of worship.
This constant fear dictated every single aspect of their practical lives.
Yeah.
You read that Christians worshipped in secret. This was a practical necessity. I mean, think about the operational security that required.
Like what? What are we talking about?
Well, using coded language, symbols like the ichthys, the fish symbol, to identify each other, meeting in the dead of night, using very discreet locations. Communication had to be flawless because any breach of confidence, any slip-up, meant a trip to the magistrate for everyone.
And the locations themselves tell a story, don't they? While, some wealthy Christians could maybe use their private homes, the enduring image of this period is the catacomb.
Yes, the catacombs, which were technically communal burial grounds, but they became sanctuaries. They offered a degree of anonymity and, crucially, access to the resting places of martyrs. This reinforced the spiritual link between the living and those who had already paid the ultimate price for their faith.
It's such a stark contrast with public Roman religion, which was all performed openly in these huge, grand temples.
Right. The Christian faith became intensely interior, private, and very localized in its expression out of necessity.
It changes everything about the ritual, doesn't it? The simplicity, the intensity that comes from that constant threat. I mean, you had to be absolutely certain you were willing to die for this. There was no space for lukewarm commitment.
None. And the consequence of failure was absolute. The sources are crystal clear on this. Discovery meant execution.
It's just brutal.
It highlights the immense risk inherent in just a simple assembly, or even just professing your belief to the wrong person. Imagine the tension in a single room where one person's hesitation or fear could result in the death of everyone present.
But that high-pressure environment, it must have fostered this intense internal purity, right? Defined by that shared willingness to suffer for what they believed was the truth of their message.
It did. And the Roman authorities, despite all their efforts, social exclusion, targeted arrests, massive imperial purges, they failed to eradicate the faith. They failed to destroy it by force.
And that failure, that's what creates this incredibly volatile environment that sets the stage for Constantine.
Exactly. The persecutors couldn't suppress the faith, but the Roman state itself was falling apart internally. This resilient, persecuted minority was still there. It was active. It was organized. Precisely when the empire needed a new source of transcendent stability. The failure of brute force opened the door for a political opportunity.
So what we have is a resilient, though very precarious religious group existing under a vast, fraying imperial authority. The stage is set not just for religious change, but for total imperial chaos.
So as we enter the early 4th century, the Roman world was just consumed by internal strife. Diocletian's brilliant structure, the tetrarchy, the rule by 4, it had completely collapsed into outright military conflict.
And our sources confirm the empire was disastrously divided.
Utterly.
The stakes here were not just about, who gets to wear the purple cloak. This was a full-blown existential crisis for Rome.
It was. The sources state it clearly. Civil war threatened its future. The entire infrastructure, the economy, the legions themselves were tearing themselves apart as these rival generals laid claim to ultimate authority.
And that instability is the critical backdrop for Constantine's rise. Power was unstable.
Completely. Constantine was one of several major claimants to that power, and he was marching his army right into the heart of that chaos. He was keenly aware that a military victory wasn't enough. He needed something more, a decisive, transcendental advantage.
Something that would validate his rule.
Yes, and unify his troops under a single, powerful new symbol.
Which brings us to the year 312 CE. Constantine, he's consolidated power in Britain and Gaul, and now he's marching toward the Italian peninsula. He's heading for Rome itself.
And his main rival in the west is Maxentius, who controls the city. This confrontation was going to be absolutely decisive. There was no turning back.
So the drama is immense. Constantine knows he's marching toward a decisive confrontation at the Milvian Bridge, which is a crossing point over the Tiber River just north of Rome.
The pressure on him must have been unbelievable. Maxentius had the advantage of the city's resources, he had more troops, and he probably had better omens from the traditional Roman gods. Constantine needed something extraordinary to happen.
And that's when it does. That's when this strange, pivotal event occurs. We read in the ancient accounts that the night before the battle, Constantine experienced a profound manifestation. A vision appeared.
It is perhaps the most famous divine intervention story in all of military history. The sources describe him seeing a cross of light that was overlaying the sun, visible to Constantine and, according to some accounts, possibly some of his troops as well.
A cross of light.
Yes. And regardless of the exact interpretation, the symbol was clear. The cross, the ultimate mark of Roman shame and execution, appearing as a sign of heavenly power.
But wait a minute. We have to address the skepticism here. For you, the listener, who's trying to get the full picture, Constantine was a shrewd political operator. He was brilliant. Are we sure this wasn't just, a retrospective narrative? Propaganda he used later to legitimize a calculated political move?
That question is absolutely central to Constantinian studies, and it's a fair one.
I mean, he could have already decided to court the growing Christian populace for political reasons.
He could have. And even if the vision was exaggerated or later embellished by Christian historians like Eusebius, the political reality is that Constantine acted on it immediately. And that's what gives it historical weight. He may have viewed the Christian God less as the soul, true divinity, and more as the newest, most powerful patron god among many a kind of Sol Invictus, an unconquered sun figure who delivered results. His commitment at this point seems very transactional.
So the victory itself would prove that the sign was effective.
Precisely. And the message that came with this sign, it wasn't theological, it wasn't complex, it was a pure military command, direct and utilitarian. In this sign, you will conquer.
All about the immediate physical success.
That's the absolute catalyst. Constantine received a promise of victory tied to a specific symbol. This validated the Christian God in a way that Mars or Jupiter had apparently failed to do in the immediate context of this civil war. This wasn't a sudden spiritual conversion in the modern sense. It was a pragmatic adoption of a powerful, successful symbol.
And the action that followed was tangible, visible, and immediate. That very night, he ordered the symbol of the cross, specifically the Chi Rho, which are the superimposed Greek letters for Christ. He ordered it painted on his soldiers' shields.
And this wasn't some spiritual retreat. This was a logistical and tactical rebranding of his entire army overnight.
Wow.
He was marking his troops as being under the protection of this new, potent entity. The psychological effect on both his own Christian soldiers, who were certainly in the ranks, and his pagan troops, who would have recognized this as a powerful new genius or protective spirit, would have been immense. It was a visible break from traditional Roman patronage.
And of course, the immediate result validated the entire action. It turned a risky campaign into a definitive win. The sources confirm. The next day, he won.
And he didn't just win. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge was a rout. Maxentius's forces were cornered by the river, and the temporary pontoon bridge he had built became a fatal weakness. Maxentius himself drowned in the Tiber. The victory was total.
Securing his control over the western half of the empire. In his mind, the symbol had worked. The sign was effective.
It was. And that victory, as you mentioned, didn't just solidify his rule. According to the sources, it brought questions about the nature of this new protective divinity. And those questions led to change. He couldn't go back to actively persecuting the group whose protective symbol had just delivered him the empire.
So the causality chain is now established.
It is. A moment of political crisis leads to a supernatural claim, which leads to a decisive military victory, which in turn demands profound political, legal, and eventually spiritual acknowledgement.
The fate of an entire religion, which had been languishing for centuries, hinged on one chaotic afternoon in 312 CE.
It's the ultimate example of how political necessity can align with religious destiny.
So once Constantine consolidates his power in the West, this process of legal transformation begins, and it was fast. It was sweeping. The key outcome, as our sources point out, is that he issued an unprecedented decree.
And we have to pause on that word. Unprecedented. This wasn't just a quiet change of heart or a minor policy tweak. It was a sweeping new legal framework for the whole empire.
And this is what we call the Edict of Milan.
We do, though it's often mislabeled as a single document. It was really a series of actions that culminated in this agreement in 313 CE, issued jointly with his eastern co-ruler, Licinius. And it granted not just specific rights, but universal religious freedom to all, with a particular emphasis on Christians.
This action signals a complete legal inversion. I mean, Rome, the imperial authority that for centuries had seen Christians as the seditious, dangerous element, now codified their right to exist and to practice their faith openly.
And it wasn't merely tolerance. It was legal establishment and a promise of state non-interference.
So let's break down exactly what this decree meant on the ground, because it immediately changed the material conditions of millions of lives across the vast Western Empire.
The reversal was total. It was designed to undo 3 centuries of hostile jurisprudence piece by piece.
Okay, so the first, most fundamental change, the one that reverses all previous legal basis for persecution, was simple. Christianity was no longer illegal.
And that single line item just dissolves the legal foundation of the entire age of martyrdom.
Gone overnight.
Gone.
Yeah.
No longer could a Roman governor demand a sacrifice or force a Christian to recant under pain of death. Their faith became a protected, legitimate choice. This immediately changed the relationship between the believer and the state from one of inherent conflict to one of potential partnership.
And the effects were immediate and profoundly personal. Our sources note that believers were released from prisons. We have to dwell on the logistics and just the emotional gravity of that for a second.
You do. Think about the sheer human scale of it. Individuals who were literally incarcerated, maybe working to death in a salt mine or waiting to be sent to the arena, were suddenly released. And not by some daring rescue mission, but by an imperial mandate signed by the very highest authority in the land.
It's unbelievable.
This demonstrated that Constantine's commitment wasn't merely philosophical. It was intensely practical and humanitarian. It signaled to everyone, Christian and pagan alike, that the political winds had shifted permanently.
Then there was the financial and institutional restoration, which really cemented the church's new public status. Confiscated property was returned. This is arguably the most complex and telling component of the decree.
Absolutely. The persecution often involved seizing church assets, lands, meeting houses, funds, valuable religious objects. Returning all this property required a massive bureaucratic reversal across the entire imperial administration.
Wow, so not just tolerance, but active restoration with state resources.
It went further than that. Constantine issued detailed instructions demanding that not only the property itself, but also the rents and profits that were derived from it since its confiscation be returned to the Christian community.
No way.
Yes. And in some cases, the imperial treasury even covered the costs of restoration when the actual property couldn't be recovered.
That's going so far beyond simple tolerance. That is the state apparatus and state funds being used to actively subsidize the restoration of the persecuted faith.
It is. And it's the moment the church transforms from a decentralized network of secret, often impoverished fellowships into a wealthy, property-owning public institution.
And with that restored property came visibility and capacity. So the policy shift culminates in the explicit allowance for public expression. Public worship was allowed. This ended the age of secrecy.
And Christians were no longer defined by what they had to hide, but by what they could now publicly proclaim.
The sources capture this physical shift so beautifully. The church emerged from the shadows. You can almost track the change geographically and architecturally across the empire.
This is where the catacombs give way to the basilicas.
Right.
The catacombs were, by their very nature, defensive subterranean spaces tied to death and secrecy. The basilicas, by contrast, were monumental public buildings. In the Roman world, a basilica was a large rectangular public hall. It was used for administration, for law courts, for imperial audiences. It was a symbol of Roman order and authority.
So, when Constantine started funding the construction of massive Christian churches, he didn't invent a new type of religious building. He gave them the most authoritative architectural model available.
He did. Using the Basilica plan, immediately signaled that Christianity was now officially sanctioned and a central public feature of the Roman state. It was competing directly with the traditional temples and forums for public space and attention.
It was a declaration in stone.
It was. Secret gatherings became open assemblies, and this change was amplified by imperial patronage, which often included funding for lavish decoration for ceremonial objects, dramatically increasing the perceived status and grandeur of the faith.
And all of this culminates in that final, most profound psychological relief. For the first time, Christians could worship without fear.
Imagine the sheer weight lifted from generations of believers.
It's almost unimaginable. This marks the full realization of imperial protection. The age of common martyrdom was, for all intents and purposes, over.
It was liberation, absolutely, but it was also his very sudden confrontation with worldly success. And it was a confrontation the church was, in many ways, completely unprepared for.
So we've established this monumental victory of freedom, but now we have to confront the complexity. As you hinted, this new liberty brought a profound, unforeseen shift in the faith's internal life. Our sources state it simply: freedom brought new challenges.
And that is the understatement of the era. The challenges were no longer external threats from pagan emperors. They were internal, existential threats to the very integrity of the faith itself.
What was the core difficulty?
The core difficulty was that the faith of martyrs now stood beside imperial power.
That's a powerful tension right there.
It is. For 3 centuries, Christianity had defined itself by its separation from the world, by its willingness to suffer, by its rejection of worldly authority. Now it was forced to reconcile its spiritual mission with this incredible new access to influence, wealth, and authority.
The very worldly attributes it had often preached against.
Exactly. And this instantly changed the profile of Christian leadership. A bishop was no longer simply a spiritual guide risking arrest. He was increasingly a political figure, managing large properties, mediating civic disputes, and wielding social influence, all backed by imperial favor.
And that new access to wealth and political clout, it must have lowered the standards for entry into the Christian community.
Of course. Ambition and political opportunism could now coexist, maybe even thrive, within the church structure in a way that was impossible before.
It forces you to ask the question, what happens when the simple act of being a Christian stops requiring personal sacrifice, the whisk of the cross, and starts requiring political calculation, the management of the basilica?
That's it, exactly. Before Constantine, purity was enforced by persecution. Hypocrites and the lukewarm quickly left or were discovered. Now, imperial favor meant patronage and funding. People started converting not out of deep conviction, but for social mobility, for access to Constantine's favor, or simply because it was now fashionable to be Christian.
And this rapid change wasn't universally welcomed by the believers themselves. Our source highlights this fundamental internal division. Some rejoiced, others worried.
And that division reflects the complexity of the response. Those who rejoiced, they saw the fulfillment of divine providence, they saw safety for their children, the opportunity for massive public expansion and charity. It was a miracle.
But the worriers,
often those who had endured the worst of the persecutions, they feared entanglement. They feared corruption. They feared that the spiritual discipline that was honed in the fire of the catacombs would be dissolved in the opulence of the imperial court.
This concern leads directly to the central provocative question that the sources raise. Had the church gained protection or lost something sacred?
Yeah.
What exactly was this sacred element that was at risk of being lost?
To understand that, we have to look back at the beginning. The sacred element that sustained them was a purity that was derived from pressure. It was the lack of worldly distraction, the absolute focus on the spiritual over the material, and the high spiritual cost of commitment.
The church was sustained by the example of martyrs.
Yes, the martyrs were the ultimate proof of their sincerity and their separation from the world.
But once the state guarantees your safety and starts giving you money and political power, that ultimate test of faith is removed. The spiritual strength that you got from being separate from the world, it risks being diluted by the necessities of managing large state endowments, administering vast buildings, and navigating imperial politics.
And this dilemma, it manifested most acutely in doctrinal disputes.
How so?
Before Constantine, arguments about theology, like the nature of Christ or the relationship between the Father and the Son, they remained largely internal, theoretical, or localized arguments among bishops.
But now these internal disputes had global implications because the emperor cared about unity.
He cared deeply about it. Constantine saw Christian unity as essential for the stability of the empire. If the faith that guaranteed his victory was now tearing itself apart, the empire would follow.
And this is where we have to introduce the ultimate example of this paradox, the Arian controversy.
Yes. Arius, a priest in Alexandria, argued that the Son, Jesus, was created by the Father and was therefore subordinate to him. This caused a massive theological rupture across the entire church. And Constantine, seeing this division as a threat to his newly unified realm, did not tell the bishops to handle it quietly. He intervened directly,
He used imperial power to enforce a theological consensus.
which culminated in 325 CE with the Council of Nicaea, which Constantine himself convened and presided over.
The emperor, a political military leader, was now setting the stage for defining Christian orthodoxy.
This is the profound shift. The moment the emperor is involved, doctrine ceases to be merely a theological matter and becomes a matter of state policy and imperial security. The Nicene Creed, the foundation of so much of modern Christian thought, was decided under the patronage and at times the pressure of the imperial state,
So orthodoxy now had imperial backing.
which means heresy could now become a civil crime.
Wow. The humility of the catacomb gives way to the power of the imperial council. The martyrs suffered for what they believed. Now, the state would enforce what you were allowed to believe.
It fundamentally altered the relationship between spiritual truth and secular power.
And regardless of this immense internal debate about corruption and entanglement, one historical truth remained undeniable. Our source material provides a great summary of it. What Rome failed to destroy by force, it now acknowledged by law.
That is the ultimate paradox of state power. All the edicts, the armies, the torture, the 3 centuries of persecution failed to achieve what one stroke of the legislative pen accomplished. By offering protection, Rome formalized and empowered the very faith it had long sought to crush.
And finally, that ultimate symbolic reversal. The cross, which was once a symbol of execution, a tool of imperial control designed for the worst offenders, now stood at the center of an empire.
It went from an image of suffering and shame to a symbol of imperial victory, state legitimacy, and universal protection.
The persecuted church had become protected. And this single massive shift defined the subsequent 1,000 years of Western history. We began this deep dive immersed in the daily reality of fear and secrecy that defined early Christian life. We navigated the political volatility of the 4th century. We tracked the dramatic intervention of the vision and the cross of light on the eve of battle. And we analyzed the resulting unprecedented legal transformation that freed believers, returned their property, and allowed for public state-sanctioned worship.
And we've seen that Constantine's actions didn't just change the legal status of Christianity, they fundamentally altered its institutional and its spiritual DNA. The transition from a clandestine existence to imperial endorsement forced the faith to confront new, challenging internal questions about wealth, authority, power, and the definition of true purity.
So, what does this all mean for us today as we look back on such a rapid change? It means a marginalized group suddenly found itself woven into the administrative, the financial, and the military fabric of the greatest political entity of the Western world.
The suffering was replaced by patronage. And that shift changed the internal landscape of belief forever. It set the precedent that Christianity could, and perhaps should, govern the affairs of state.
And the history of the world is full of these moments, isn't it? Where rapid, sudden shifts in fortune introduce all these new complexities.
It is. For the Christians of the 4th century, the faith that survived by enduring execution now had to survive the insidious dangers of influence and political compromise.
We'll leave you with the central tension that arose in the wake of Constantine's decree. It's a question that thinkers grappled with then, and one we still consider today. When a faith gains immense worldly power and state protection, is the cost of that safety a fundamental dilution of the core spiritual discipline and the radical separation from the world that sustained it through 3 centuries of martyrdom and hiding? Something for you to explore as you continue your learning journey.